Good evening, everyone. I am Paul Rogers, Jerry Grout, Director of Education and Engagement, and I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's program at Phoenix Art Museum, and to wish you all a happy Thanksgiving tomorrow. To begin, I'd like to thank the Tony and Mylena Astorga Foundation for their generous support of the Amalia Mesa-Bains lecture series. Tonight's presenter, Professor Kathryn E, who I'm very excited to introduce, is an architectural historian and professor at Trinity University in San Antonio, where she teaches courses on modern architecture and Latin American art. She holds a BA from Wellesley College and an MA and PhD in the history of art from the University of Pennsylvania. Her work has written widely on art, architecture, and landscape in the Americas. She is the author of Modern Architecture in Mexico City, History, Representation, and the Shaping of a Capital, which received the Alice Davis Hitchcock Award from the Society of Architectural Historians. And, and she also is writing a forthcoming Home, Heat, Money, God, Texas, and Modern Architecture. She serves on the Visiting Committee on Latin American Art at the San Antonio Museum of Art and is a founder and the president of Design Forum, a San Antonio nonprofit. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Kathryn E. O'Rourke.
Good evening. Happy Thanksgiving almost. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you, Paul, for having me, and the entire museum staff for letting me be part of this wonderful exhibition. I feel really honored to be here and to get to talk to you and really with you, I hope, about the work of Amalia Mesa-Bains. And rather than read you a formal lecture, I thought it would be more interesting for us to have a bit of a conversation. So I'm not going to read from my notes. I'm going to talk through slides and talk about different aspects of her work. Let me just check. This is the, yeah, great, okay. So as you heard, I am an architectural historian by training, and I'm also an art historian, but my expertise is really in architecture. And one of the things that fascinates me so much about Mesa-Bains' work is its engagement with space and the ways in which it implies interiors, but also is deeply bound up with questions about land and landscape. And I have to say, I feel extra honored to be here, and I spent much of the day driving in the Arizona desert, and I feel very connected to land here at this moment and thinking about that. But I wanted to think with you about landscape in her work as it relates to some of her major themes that she has articulated at various points in interviews, and most, in some ways, I think, poignantly and pointedly in an essay that she wrote in the 1990s called Domesticana, which of course refers to domesticity, but is in many ways a response to a very important theory of Chicano visual culture called rasquachismo. Rasquachismo was written about and articulated by Tomás Ibarra, who, like Amalia Mesa-Bains, is a scholar. He is Chicano. He, like Amalia, was very much involved in the Chicano movement in the 1960s, and is one of the people who has brought Chicano art and culture to a much wider audience than those who first knew it. And one of the things that he has talked about in talking about what rasquachismo is the way in which visual culture, and especially, again, for my interests, especially in landscape and in urban environments, is a means of subverting certain sort of white norms, right? Some of the dominant norms of U.S. culture. And that rasquachismo is a kind of, it implies a certain improvisation. And you see this, these are just two very sort of general examples of what rasquachismo might look like. And I'm starting with this so that you have a sense of what Mesa-Bains is going to be responding to. Ibarra talks a lot about yard art, talks about the ways that people who create rasquachista landscapes will take objects and items from popular culture, often very inexpensive ones, to reshape their landscapes and their houses. And you see, for example, also juxtaposition, right, is a very important part of the visual language of rasquachismo. On the right, that's a barbacoa place in San Antonio, and you see the kind of combinations of forms, just to give you an example here, of the way that it's symbols, right, whether they're sports logos for sports teams, or religious imagery, allusions, of course, to fizzy drinks. Big Red is a popular drink, right? Or the U.S. flag there, are all intermingled, right? So this sense of layering, the sense of borrowing, the sense of appropriating as a means of somehow articulating visually, right? Pushing it back against a kind of normal landscapes. Very important in rasquachista visual practice and spatial practice are the creation of shrines, right? Sometimes inside the house, so these are going to be very important for Mesa-Bains, but also on the outside, yard shrines in particular. And you see an example here. Of course, both of these are dedicated to the Virgin of Guadalupe. One in what looks like a probably plastic wash tub with plants, probably genuine, but sometimes artificial plants you'll see in these as well. And then, of course, Christmas lights. And then this is a photograph also of a yard in San Antonio where we have, again, of course, a very familiar sort of bucket from Lowe's, from the hardware store, intermingled with this concrete image of the Virgin of Guadalupe, and then these tin figures. These are objects, right? And as it were, sort of mini landscapes that Ibarra-Frausto has helped explain, and which Mesa-Bains starts to think about, right, or has thought about, of course, a lot. And she is, I think I mentioned to you, she's good friends with Tomas, and so they, of course, have a very deep conversation going on over many years now. This is how she sums up rasquachismo, right? She says, in rasquachismo, it is the irreverent and the spontaneous are employed to make the most from the least, right? So making do with what's available, that aspect of improvisation, particularly in communities where there isn't a lot of extra money, right, to go buy fancy things. Rasquachismo is a stance that is both defiant and inventive, and that's part of what has drawn our historians, I think, and historians of culture to it so much. It's very, very creative, right? Fragmentation and recombination are some of the devices in rasquachismo, okay? The sense of breaking apart, again, related to the idea of doing with what is available, recombining things. It is indeed a worldview that provides an oppositional identity. We've been talking about that. And the dual function of resistance and affirmation is essential to the sensibility of rasquachismo. And Ibarra-Frausto has really talked about this as a sensibility, right? It's not quite a style, but a sensibility. Survivalist irreverence that functions as a vehicle of cultural continuity, so that there's a certain kind of legibility or recognizability in rasquache things. Okay, and you know, it is both rural, or she notes of Tomas's work in describing it, that rasquachismo is both rural and urban. I would say too that it's also it's particularly it is rural, but it seems to manifest strongly in dense neighborhoods, right? In places where people gather, right, where there is a strong sense of community, or in suburban or perhaps less urban contexts as a means of signifying cultural presence, right, cultural selfhood. All right. So what is the relationship between these two things? Mesa-Bains, one of her very earliest works is The Ofrenda for Dolores de Brio. And you have seen it, I hope. Has everyone seen the show here? Yeah. It's so beautiful, isn't it? It's so beautiful. I'm so excited. And it's so much of her work is here at once. All right. So The Ofrenda, of course, honors Dolores del Rio, the famous movie star, right, the star of Golden Age cinema in Mexico in the 1940s. So just right off the bat, right, there are things that you can see in these two examples that are similar. That sense of accumulation, the accretion of objects, the building up of the surface. And Mesa-Bains takes that to an even greater level than what we see in more informal rasquachista landscapes like the one that I'm showing you on the left, right? She has a very meticulous, very elegant, very careful way of using objects, right? Of selecting and recombining in a way that is, as she talks about over and over, of course, very much about her engagement with the Baroque, right? The traditions of Baroque art as a kind of visual language of excess and ornament, right? And glitter and shiny things and sensual things and sort of overabundance, but also with various tropes of femininity, right? And so, she begins to say, in describing what domesticana, her theory is, that we're going to talk about it much more, she says, domesticana begins to reposition the Chicana through the working of feminine space, right? To reposition the Chicana through the working of feminine space, right? Mesa-Bains, like some other Chicana feminists, activists, will recognize in the Chicana movement, right, the ways in which women were excluded, right? The ways in which, as much as it is a liberation movement, it was also, in certain respects, very patriarchal. And so part of what she will try to do with Domesticana is to push back on some of that patriarchy, right? So Domesticana will be kind of doing double duty, right? It's about asserting her status as a woman, a Mexican-American woman, right, whose parents came to the United States. They did not have high papers when they arrived. A woman who grew up in a family of very powerful and important women. And it means then of resisting also the patriarchal structures that keep women enclosed and encased. And that's part of what I think we'll talk about more with the art. It's just an interesting in some of these works. So, what is domesticana? Domesticana is the application, she says, of feminist theory to rasquachista principles, right? The application of feminist theory to rasquachista principles. What does it mean to feminize rasquachismo? Is there another stage in the development of this sensibility that is irreverent and recombining and accretion, that is interested in accretion, and also one that is very affirming? And I think, again, there's a sort of depth and richness of meaning that Mesa-Bains will bring to Domesticana and bring to her work that is so multi-layered, right, that it takes the idea of accretion and recombination in rasquachismo even further. And this has to do with the fact that she is herself a scholar. She's a brilliant thinker. These are incredibly dense, complicated, rich works of art. There are so many levels of ideas, so many references in even a single piece that this is it's part of what I think is so rich about. They're just there's so many things that we can say about each one of them. All right, the sphere of the domestic, she will say, includes home embellishments, home altar maintenance, healing traditions, and personal feminine pose or style. Okay, Domesticana is a resistance to majority culture and patriarchy. Okay, and that techniques of subversion through play with traditional imagery and cultural materials are being used in Domesticana, right? So there's much that is similar, but again, she's going to take it even further. Here's the ofrenda again, just to we can begin to look at it. Of course, what she will do with this ofrenda, this is the first sort of major piece, is adapt the practice of creating home altars, and you all may be familiar with these, for loved ones who have died, right? And this is very, very common in Chicano culture, right? In other some other Latinx cultures, of building an altar in your house to remember someone who is beloved, who is gone. And she will think about that, I think, in terms not just of a kind of ritual practice that is culturally specific, but also in relationship to labor, right? And this is one of the things that she has reflected on in some of her conversations more recently, is the way in which feminism in a Chicana context has been very closely bound to labor leaders, like Dolores Huerta, for example, like Emma Tenayuca, who organized the conch shellers, right? That, and Mesa-Bains distinguishes that from some of the aspects of white feminism, the importance of work. And that work is, of course, for many women, historically, has been done inside, right? In the spaces of the home. All right. It is also, of course, that domestic labor and the making of things like ofrendas about care, right? How much labor goes together with nurturing, with care, with tending, right? And again, I think that the notion or the kind of metaphor of accretion is really important in this regard, kind of building up of stuff, of associations, right? The multiple pictures of the loved one, the objects, right? The jewelry boxes, the gloves, the perfume bottles, right? All of the little things that we keep, that we hold on to, because they remind us of the people that we love, and that they become meaningful, not because the objects themselves are worth anything, right, in the market, but because they have this kind of connection. And that she's thinking about the layers of caretaking, right, and tending. And also then how those kinds of things, particularly in ofrendas perhaps that are made to women, and obviously Dolores Del Rio is not her relative, right? But the ways that they serve and the act of making serves to connect people generationally, right? As a kind of device for keeping memory alive. The ofrenda for Dolores Del Rio also introduces, right, this theme of kind of exaggerated femininity, right? What does it mean to hang all of this incredibly sensual pink satin, right? The kind of material, right, of Hollywood glamour, we might say, okay? The rose petals, and I don't know if you've noticed that you can smell them, right? When you see them in the show here, it's very powerful. I think you can around and see that. The lace, right? The tulle, all of these things that are coded as so conventionally female, feminine, right? Mesa-Bains, as part of resisting patriarchy through these works, is going to seek to reclaim this kind of feminine pose, right? And say, I'm going to use it and recombine it and push it back out into the world, right? To make that statement very strong. I also am fascinated by this early work because, to my mind, and again, I'm interested in the ways that particularly these installations like this, and then later, we'll talk about much more, the Venus Envy chapters seem to be like landscape, that she is creating spaces, places in interiors. I think that's already happening here. Just some of those details that we were talking about, the rose petals, right? These tins, right, that would have contained, of course, film, the names, right? And there's so many names, there's so many historical references. Maria Candelaria, another actress, right? The roses, of course, the Virgin of Guadalupe, and then so many wonderful, sort of shiny gold beads, and of course pearls there. The Queen of the Waters, Mother of the Land of the Dead, Homenaje a Tonantzin Guadalupe, a work of 1992. Again, beautifully reinstalled just here in the galleries. This, I think, again, to me, begins even more to develop the idea of landscape and this connection between the creation of the kind of altar-like space and land, this theme that is going to run through the work over and over. And of course, you will begin to notice, and we'll look at others as we go through, right, the way that Mesa-Bains will use dirt or stones or pebbles or plant material on the floor, right, as if to create, again, this kind of literal connection to the earth, to suggest these sort of relationships. The Virgin of Guadalupe, I imagine, is familiar to all of you. I've been talking about her as if she is. She's, of course, the apparition of the Virgin Mary that is understood to have taken place in Tepeyac, in Mexico City, shortly after the Spanish conquest in the 1530s. And the apparition of the Virgin to the indigenous peasant Juan Diego was incredibly propitious, of course, for the development of Catholicism and Christianity in the Americas. And she is revered, of course, by people all over the world, but especially in Mexico and Mexican Americans. Tonantzin was the indigenous fertility goddess who was revered at the site, at the place where the Virgin of Guadalupe appeared. So what Mesa-Bains is doing here is talking to us about this kind of doubling, right? The Tonantzin and Guadalupe are maybe not so different, right? And they're certainly not so different for indigenous people who recognize multiple kinds of practices, multiple aspects of faith traditions. The association with water, of course, has a variety of associations with fertility, with the earth, with the fecundity, but it's also significant in this particular case in Mexico City because the place where the Virgin of Guadalupe appeared, by tradition, a well miraculously sprouted up from the ground at the spot where she appeared. So this sort of multiple set of illusions, right, is one of the things that we're going to see again and again. She will use, of course, again, these fabulous details. Shells, they appear in later works, again, in this marvelously Baroque way. There's this wonderful density and sort of buildup of texture and surfaces, color, but also then mirrors and shards of glass. And those mirrors, of course, will reappear in all sorts of ways in later works. So just to kind of like put this idea of landscape to foreground it a little bit more, I'm showing you a very famous painting on the right by Maria Velasco, the Valley of Mexico, seen from the Santa Isabel Hill, a 19th century work. And he painted many versions of this painting and was the preeminent landscape painter in 19th century Mexico. The aspect of landscape in a work like the one on the left, at a kind of superficial level, has to do with horizontality, I think, right? The sense that, of course, we read landscape horizontally. But it also has to do, I think, with the issue of picking and choosing, the aspect of recombining forms. In Velasco's work, we see a series of references, just as we do in Mesa-Bains'. Okay? And I don't know if you are sitting close enough you can see in the foreground what this is. Let's see, how about right there? Does that work? What that is?
Nopal.
A nopal, right. And what is this? Yes, an eagle, exactly, right? And the nopal and the eagle in Mexico mean what?
The place where the Aztecs built.
Yes, good, right, of course. Tenochtitlan, and the tradition, and again, you all probably can picture the Mexican flag that has the eagle on the cactus. That is this place by tradition where the Mexica stopped, right, and settled and built Tenochtitlan, Mexico City. So right here in the foreground, and it's very subtle. It's not anywhere near as sort of nationalistic as, for example, what we see on the Mexican flag. Velasco is going to include these details. But what he's also going to do is propose, of course, a kind of recognizable landscape. And we're looking south here toward Mexico City, and you see these mountains. The view is more or less from the position, from the general area of where Tonantzin and Guadalupe kind of resided, where they were, right? To picture a landscape, and a lot of people talk about this, written about this, is of course to suggest a kind of control of it, right? That when we begin to describe land, right, whether through cartography or drawing or painting, that is a way of curtailing it, right? Of taking a view of it. The relationship, and think here about the relationship between surveying, right, and real estate. The way in which nature gets carved up through the mechanisms of maps, okay? In the 19th century, a great age of nationalism, of course, in many places, it's also an era of landscape painting, right? And it's really taken off in a lot of places. And part of what works like this are doing are also offering an idea now of a natural landscape as a national one, right? That we read this, he means for us to read this not just as rocks and cactus and brush, right? And the eagle and mountain from the distance, but indeed as Mexico, okay? So part of what I'm proposing here is that we think about the ways in which Mesa-Bains' work is going to, as it is subverting or aiming to subvert patriarchal cultures, is also challenging or working through these metaphors of land and landscape as they are connected themselves to a kind of nationalistic dominance of land, okay? The other thing, just to mention while we have Velasco here, that we're gonna get rid of them, is the way in which, of course, anytime we are looking at a landscape painting or a photograph, we are always only seeing a partial view. And we know this, but we don't necessarily dwell on it, okay? I would be curious about your responses to this. One of the things that I find very powerful about Mesa-Bains' work is our sense that these are interiors, scenes that are somehow spatial, right? That we have not fully, that we don't fully get to see the whole of them, right? That they are also sort of partial views, okay? And I want to just say before we leave Velasco. This is what Mesa-Bains says about landscape. Landscape often reveals our histories and our conflicts. Nature, too, is marked by the signs of our abuse. It stands as a witness to our struggles for spaces and rights. All space is at all times social, physical, and geographic, and that no space is empty when we reach it, as the memories of those who walked there before us are there. This sense of geographic memory is especially critical to those displaced communities whose roots in the continent predate the Anglo intervention. Okay? So the additional layers that she will understand when she's thinking about landscape have to do with history. Okay? And the layers of history, particularly as they are related to colonialism and to deterritorialization and to imperialism on the part of Anglo settlers. All right. This is an amazing chart. This is in the catalog. If you haven't gotten the catalog, be sure you get the catalog. This is Mesa-Bains' chart of the different kinds of objects that she will use in her works, right? And these installations, right, they are, of course, they come apart, right? You can't, it's not like painting, you just put it in storage. You sort of build them and take them down. And she has organized them, these 60 objects that she uses, or the kinds of objects that she uses over and over. Spiritual objects, healing objects, historic objects, scientific objects, cultural objects, personal mementos, and then furnishings. I told you there's a huge range of references. It's really quite vast. And again, this is the work of a person who is deeply interested in histories of art, histories of culture, and the ways in which, of course, those fuse them with her own personal memories and experiences. All right, Circle of Ancestors. Also beautifully installed here, a work of 1995. This grouping of 7 chairs is so room-like, right? And yet it is not fully a room. We are invited in the arrangement of the chairs, of course, to imagine the people who are not in them, right? And she brings us into consciousness of who isn't there by putting these wonderful images on the backs of the chairs. They're oval shaped, as you see, of course, with mirrors. And she includes herself, she includes her 2 grandmothers, her mother, the artist Judy Baca, who she admires, a friend of hers, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who we'll see more of, who she returns to again and again, and also to the Aztec deity Coyolxauhqui. Okay? So putting together, literally imagining these women, right, sitting together in a circle. That place begins to be created imaginatively by this presence, okay, that is fugitive, obviously, right, and imaginary, but almost palpable. And that's where, again, I think the sort of sensuality of the materials is so potent. All right, Sor Juana, there she is. Some of you probably know about Sor Juana. This is a painting Miguel Cabrera. Cabrera was probably the foremost portraitist of the 18th century in Mexico. Sor Juana, of course, was actually, it's a posthumous portrait, we did many copies of it, but she lived in the 17th century and was a feminist and a scholar. She had this amazing library, and she got into all kinds of trouble with the Archbishop for criticizing him, and is probably one of the first great feminists of the Americas. Mesa-Bains returns to her again and again. And again, I think that's, it's such a sort of appropriate figure in so many ways, this scholar, artist, writer that Mesa-Bains is thinking about this woman. Anyway, you see her there, of course, in the yellow chair. All right, when the Circle of Ancestors was installed in the 90s, some of the botanical prints were installed, as you see, or hung in the museum nearby. So this is not the best quality image, but you can see that they're there, which is part of what has led me to think about the relationship between land and landscape and these installations, right? That the imagery, the botanical imagery that will recur again and again, the ways in which she uses now to montage, right? Again, a kind of layering, a kind of sense of accretion, is very much in dialogue with these room-like, or we might begin to even think of them, I'm suggesting, as landscape-like spaces. And of course, the notion of accretion, of sedimentation, of building up is a geological one, and it's a biological one. And what is history if not a sense of layers, right? And what are our lives, our families, our identities, if not a series of layers, one on top of the other? I think Mesa-Bains is getting at that, right? She's working through that in all of these different media, and the range is quite dramatic. Also, what comes in really clearly in the prints, as you see from their titles, is politics, right? The experiences of migration, right? The braceros, of course, pictured here on the left, the image of the strikes during the Chicana movement, okay? She will pull together then this botanical imagery, the sense of roots, the roots of plants that go down deep, of course, the roots of our families, of our lives, the roots of struggle, the continuation of struggle that has extended, of course, over centuries and across a territory that has not always had borders. So Kahlo, Frida Kahlo, is of course another important reference for Mesa-Bains, and another Titanic artist of the Americas, obviously. Self-portrait on the borderline between Mexico and the United States in 1932 is a work that I would love to know what she thinks about it, if she lives into what she consciously has reflected on it in the prints. But of course, Kahlo, probably many of you know Kahlo's work. She also is very, very interested in nature, in botanical imagery. There's a great exhibition of Frida Kahlo's garden several years ago at the New York Botanical Garden that dealt with a lot of these questions. Kahlo here too, even though she's of course a Mexican woman, created this painting when she and Rivera were in Detroit, and he was painting the great cycle there at the Detroit Institute of Art. And it's a painting, of course, that is about her own sense of ambiguity and perhaps unhappiness, right? That she is somehow between these two cultures at one time, even though she's not going to stay in the United States, in the sense of conflict about them. And Kahlo, of course, would code Mexico as ancient and indigenous, and the United States as modern and industrial. All right. So probably the greatest single body of work, right? And really, probably very most important works in Mesa-Bains' ode are the Venus Envy chapters, right? And this is a series of works that she creates. There are 4 of them, but the 3 main ones, or the 3 first ones, are created in the 1990s, in which all of these ideas of domesticana that we've been talking about really start to come together and become even clearer. And particularly in Venus Envy Chapter 1, First Holy Communion, Moments Before the End, first installed in 1993, and then last year in San Francisco and again in Berkeley before. This is the work that Mesa-Bains has said that's where domesticana really starts to come out. So let's look at this together. And again, you've seen this. It has 3 parts, Venus Envy, and Venus Envy, of course, is a title, it's a play on penis envy, and that's very intentional. And I think is a kind of ultra cool domesticana rasquachista move on her part, because it's funny, right? And a little bit irreverent, and like you're not really supposed to say those things, but she's going to do it. All right. So it has 3 parts. There are different people, sort of, or types that are imagined in the space of Venus Envy. One is the bride, one is the nun, and one is the Virgin Mary, of course. So the bride, this is the bridal chamber right there. I'll detail that in just a moment. The Virgin is right here. This is kind of personal altar. And we see different depictions, really most of them modern depictions, several by Yolanda Lopez, the great Chicana artist, of the Virgin there. And then on this side, this series of references, of course, to saints and reproductions of them. And again, what's part of so fabulous, I think, about this work, much of her work, is that she uses reproductions, right? There's no fear of the copy. And that's, again, a kind of rasquachista thing. And you'll see, I mean, in some of these frames, let's see if I have detail, there we go. I mean, I think these are probably very inexpensive reproductions, right? Like the postcards you could buy at the museum gift store, perhaps. And off-the-shelf picture frames, right? It's not about the kind of preciousness of each individual object, yet she manages to convey a kind of preciousness, beautifulness right, of the whole, right? And that the craft is in the assembling. The craft is in the, again, the labor, the work of putting it together. And again, I think it just resonates on so many levels, right? How many of us have like cheap frames at home that we might have pictures in that are not like particularly valuable at all? I think there they are. In chapter 1, the mirrors come in a really big way. And the mirrors she will get, I mean, you saw them on the chairs already with all the ancestors, but here she will kind of put on them these images of, often in this case, of course, of saints, the crowned nun you see there. There's the famous Bernini Ecstasy of St. Teresa in the middle there, the sculpture, the Baroque sculpture. But she will invite us to play with looking in such sophisticated ways. And I was noticing this going through the show here, and it's quite an intense experience actually in the gallery. You walk up and you think you're going to look at Bernini, right, or whatever, and then of course you look at yourself, right? And what a powerful idea, what a powerful metaphor that is of saying, let's invite the viewer, as she thinks she's about to engage with a work of art, to suddenly be thinking about herself, to reflect back, again, a kind of manipulation of the feminine, and of course the idea, right, of the mirror as this object of self-love, or something that women are somehow imagined to be particularly interested in. The boudoir, here it is. The boudoir is the you know, sort of the star of the show, I have to say, with this, of course, the bridal chamber, but also the play on the notion of First Holy Communion, and we see in the cases that go back to just a minute like this. This is one of the cases that's installed there in the gallery. Pictures, right, of Mesa-Bains at her First Communion. Of course, all sorts of images associated with wearing white dresses and veils and prayer cards, right? But to go back here to the notion of performing femininity, right? And yet what she's going to put in the mirror in this case is the Coatlicue, right? And the Coatlicue is one of the most extraordinary sculptures ever created, probably around 1400 or so by Mexica sculptors. And the Coatlicue is this amazingly strong feminine deity in Mexica cosmology, and she is this incredible sort of monster figure, larger than life size. You can see it if you ever go to the Anthropology Museum in Mexico City. Go and spend some time with it. There she is totally ending the conventions of Victorian marriage, right, that are enlaced, of course, through displays like this. All right. Chapter 2 of Venus Envy is increasingly spatial, right? We have the partial moment of being in the boudoir, the landscape of the bedroom, the landscape of the private inner sanctum. After Mesa-Bains goes to Istanbul and goes to the Topkapi Museum and starts to think about the tradition of harems and sultans, she creates the harem and other enclosures. And this is where Sofwana also will return, okay? These works, right, in this chapter present us even more complete worlds, right, or the conjuring, as it were, of even more complete worlds than, say, we saw in Venus Envy 1. The library for Sofwana Inés de la Cruz reconfigures or reimagines Sofwana's, let's see, there it is, Sofwana's desk. And again, to bring her painting back. It was so beautifully, so wonderfully installed here with that red. I love the red on the wall there. It's such an evocative installation there. The idea that Sofwana, of course, was a kind of polymath. So Mesa-Bains is going to think about her then as this polymath, but clutter up that desk, right? There's going to be all kinds of mess on it and all sorts of references, photographs, of course, objects too that she has found, Mesa-Bains has found in flea markets, right, in the most ordinary kinds of places. The connection here too, right, is, that I think is so powerful with the idea of the harem has to do with enclosures, right? This is, Sofwana worked in a cloister, right? She was a cloistered woman, as so many women have been in different ways. And for Mesa-Bains, evoking Sofwana with the idea of the harem which right there, you've seen it. This is, I think there's a photograph of this installed in Williams College in the show here. Is about the idea of, again, as it were, taking women out of the world, right? Out of the landscapes of patriarchy through the mechanisms of patriarchy and placing them in these places that take them out of view. And yet where Mesa-Bains, I think, invites us to imagine also great works of creation occur, right? She talks about the harem, in fact, as a place where, oh my gosh, these women made such beautiful things, and they were artists, and they were writers, and this is a very provocative idea for her, this notion of this kind of community of women living and working together. Also in this chapter is the Virgin's Garden, and here again the notion of the landscape becomes perhaps even more explicit, this kind of play with nature. This is a scene, a work in which the armoire appears, and you may have noticed there are a series of chests or armoires in other works. The armoire has to do, of course, with enclosures. That's part of how it is related to the idea of the harem, the space that is enclosed, and it also has to do, as we've been saying, with notions of performance, of clothing, of fashion, right, of what gets put on. Mesa-Bains is also playing with the notion of the Virgin herself as a kind of garden, right? The notion the womb is this kind of sacred garden for Christ, and starting to say, oh no, wait a minute, what if we imagine the Virgin herself as this garden, right? And there she's on the outside. The Master of Frankfurt Paradise Garden is a painting that Mesa-Bains explicitly was responding to and thinking about, right? What would it mean, again, if we started to imagine the Virgin herself having a kind of garden that is about this, about the kind of hiding and opening up? And Gaston Bachelard, who's a great theorist of space, has written about the notion of the furniture, right? The furniture of the cabinet as being this place of enclosure, but also mystery, a kind of thing that for many, he even talks about this, right? Like for children, the memory of closets and the memory of cabinets and chests of drawers and the kind of things that are hidden, right? How evocative these kinds of things are as spaces unto themselves, right? What we put away, what we hide, and the delight of opening doors, right? Being surprised at having things come out. All right. So the Venus and Beast series continues in the 90s with Siwatlampa, the place of the giant women, right? And so you can see then that the scale is also growing, right, through these kinds of works. There's been the kind of semi-room of the boudoir already, the imagined space, perhaps the landscape garden happening in the Virgin's Garden and in the harem and in Sorbonne study. And now the place of the giant women will open landscape up in a completely new way, right, with this central sculpture that is the kind of figure of the giant woman there, moss covered in the center of the gallery, looking like Earth herself, a kind of reworking perhaps of certain fertility goddesses. And there she is yet again sort of lounging and looking into this amazingly rich shell-encrusted mirror. The place that is being evoked here now is a giant imagined territory, the place of the giant women, the place of the Amazons. This is the place where there are women warriors in Aztec tradition. This is also the place where women who have died in childbirth go, right? Again, one of the most elemental forms of labor for many women. The ones who give their lives for their work in this way, give their lives for a kind of generational continuity. And Mesa-Bains loves this idea of these warrior women, right? And what would it be like if we had a world in which it were possible to still have warrior women rather than women who were consistently told, no, be quiet, go away, you're too loud, you're too fat, you're too weird, you're too whatever, this is not part of your world, okay? So she is celebrating these, the possibility, I think, here, of a different sort of world, okay? Installed here too, you see the two great vestments, and you've seen this in the show. The one on the left over here with copper and wire, and they're kind of almost like sticks that are coming out, again, that's their theme of nature. That's this huge tunic-like form with this amazing high-heeled shoes. I don't know if you looked closely at those. They give sense now of just how huge these warrior women would have been in her mind, and they're still glamorous, right? They're still beautiful. There's still this aspect of hanging on to the fun aspects of glamour and subverting it and wearing amazingly bedazzling high-heeled shoes with a tunic that is perhaps evocative, I think, of this, the form of the great Inca tunics, right, that were very rectangular, worn by Inca nobility and warriors. And similarly, its pendant, right, on the other side of the gallery, as you know, is this extraordinary 10-foot tall, right, feather tunic. Again, you can imagine a huge, giant woman wearing this, probably actually about the size of the Coatlicue, right? If you think about that, I should look at it, I can't remember exactly how tall she is. But of course, in Aztec warrior traditions in battle, feathers were often worn, right? They would often dress up as eagle knights, right? And others for going into battle. So what does it mean then to put on these kinds of clothes, right? To become warrior women, to dress ourselves perhaps in the ways of course, indigenous warriors here. And just two details of it, the notion of the landscape coming into the space of the gallery, right, upsetting the easy boundaries between inside and outside, and Mesa-Bains talks about this. This is part of what's been happening with the material on the floor already, the sand, the rose petals, the leaves, the other things that you've seen on the floor. Now we start to begin to have this kind of full garden, and this shell that is just turned into this amazing sculpture right there. The notion of the inside and the outside blurring, right? That's a kind of, that goes even back to her engagement with the altars, right? The home altars are inside, but they're also sometimes made outside the yard. The way in which women, of course, are often mediators between the interior worlds of family life and all of the stuff that happens on the outside that comes in to affect the family. Also in this gallery, we see some more of the prints. These are the Teotihuacan twins of 1997, and then also the Guadalupe twins. So we'll start with the Teotihuacan twins here. This is a figure, right, an indigenous ceramic figure that has a kind of cavity in it, as you can see in the torso, where there was there's a little bit of disagreement about what the figurine is inside, but it's often recognized as, of course, a kind of fertility image, right? But might also refer to the indigenous idea of ways that humans carry within inside themselves different kinds of powers or have access to certain aspects of God, of nature, right? Of these kind of huge, giant natural forces. Mesa-Bains is going to double that again, kind of multiplying. You see so much multiplication in her work, and there is sort of on a, again, this kind of reflection now on her own, perhaps dealing with her own questions of her multiple identity, her Mesa-Bains as an indigenous woman, again, as a carrier of certain kinds of tradition that are now not just related to the natural world and kind of reproductive childbirth, but an intellectual lineage, right? What does it mean to carry on a tradition of being women intellectuals into the modern world? So with the Guadalupe twins here too, the quotation I think again very clearly is Frida's work, right? Those Fridas of 1939, and the kind of core object here is a kind of doll or maquette figure that Mesa-Bains cuts out. You see it's almost like it's kind of anatomical section with fetus, right? Very clearly referencing, obviously, reproduction. On the other side, there's the Virgin of Guadalupe. The play here is with the old, tired trope of the virgin whore, right? That animates a lot of Mexican patriarchal thinking and culture, and the idea that might be complicated in some way. The two Fridas, of course, Kahlo there is thinking about her own complicated self, right, and creation of self, and the pressures, right, that are put on her to be this Victorian woman on the one hand early on, and then the way I think, right, obviously she's kind of performing a role as a by wearing the dress of the women of Rwanda right there. All right, and then we get to pride in public landscapes and territories. This is, at least in my reading of it, a point where the work begins to become even more political. This is a piece that she creates in kind of recognition or acknowledgement of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848, which is the legal document in which so much of Mexican territory was ceded to the United States after the war, 1846-48. For Mesa-Bains, she's of course very, very much interested in the long-term impacts of deterritorialization, what it means to have been part of one place and then no longer be part of that place. And her own relatives had been involved in 1867 with the deposition of the Emperor Maximilian, who had been imposed on Mexico by France during the U.S. Civil War. And so it's a complicated series of layers of history there. But that's part of why we have this sort of French formal garden, which seems to come out of nowhere, right, if you've been following the work. But that's the reference there. The theme of politics and migrations intensifies, I think, in this work, where these agaves, so very strongly coded as Mexican and as this sort of nationalist symbol, are now glass, and there are shards of glass all around them. They become sharp, not just in the ways that the spikes, right, of the gaze of some of the succulents are very sharp, but in a really painful, kind of dangerous way, along with the sort of overly elegant mirrored walls there of the cabinet. There's a kind of cruelness, a kind of coldness, I think, to this work that invites us to think about the violence of migration, certainly as it was becoming more violent in 2001 after September 11th, right, when it became even harder for people to cross the border in both directions. I'm going to just keep going here, I don't want to keep you too long. I wanted to just briefly mention her work on the Randolph, right, the Cabinet of Curiosities, which is a type, of course, that comes out of Europe in the 17th century, well, even earlier, but we think of it as really a 17th century type that in so many ways is about a kind of colonialist gaze, right? This is when people in Europe started creating these cabinets of curiosities, and they would fill them with, weird, interesting, exotic objects that, people were bringing back from the Americas, from Africa, from Asia. And Mesa-Bains has done a lot of work reflecting on the Wunderkammer as a kind of prototype or kind of proto-museum, right? The ways in which museums are, this is changing, right? But have historically been kind of colonialist institutions, collecting and grabbing and displaying curiosities from other places for an elite audience. As part of her sort of series with that, she created this print, which I find very fascinating, right? It is about, of course, Mexico City, the battle for the gods of Tenochtitlan, in which now she, too, is going to combine images, associations, right, to talk about political, territorial, landscape, conquest in the Valley of Mexico there. She reuses this print from the 1790s, right, this view of a redesigned Zócalo, main plaza there in Mexico City. Of course, the famous map of 1524 that Cortez sent to Europe, documenting one of the first images we have made by Europeans of Tenochtitlan. And then there's the Coatlicue, again, of course, also with the sculpture of Christ. They're all somehow hovering around this landscape that has been changed again and again and again through this process, of sedimentation, of colonization there. Related, of course, is the map of loss. She's reflecting even more powerfully, potently on aspects of loss in colonialism, with respect in this case to the Andes, right, to what is Peru now, and then quite recently, emblems of the decade, of course, borders created since 2016, in which she includes self-portraits made by students, right, DACA students, and I think is reflecting very much about the sort of sadness of the current immigration policy, even more the ways in which the United States still does not operate in a position of care and love, right, toward people who want to come here. So the notion here then of the landscape, the domestic landscape, I think sort of comes in interesting ways full circle with a work like this, because we are kind of back in the space of those early works, right, of Tomancin, Virgin of Guadalupe, and yet we have a sense of it as partial, we have a sense of it as a place that perhaps someone has just stepped out of. There's the species of the cabinet, right, it's this chest of drawers, and yet now, in a very, very pointed way, she's thinking about politics that are so intimately, directly connected to land and the notion of drawing lines, right, very arbitrarily, actually, in land and landscape. And then just to end with these two, obviously direct reflections on her own family, on her own ancestors. She uses, of course, her grandmother and other relatives in this image on the left. Mesa-Bains had an Afro-Mexican heritage, and she very much acknowledges that and interested in the many kinds of blending that had happened in her own life, and the kind of roots and movements and recombinations of people and lives that happen. And that's expressed, I think, in Tree of Life here of 2001. And I find it very poignant, right? She overlays these photographs historic photographs of her family members, of course, with an image of a tree, and the references to many Tree of Life images in Christianity, right? The sense of a kind of deeply rooted but also widely branching image. And then she writes, "Memory heals the wounds of those who came before us," right? Asking us to think about the way that memory is somehow historical and embedded and layered and full of accretion and sedimentation, right? And perhaps also in some ways curative, right? A kind of work of care. Can we somehow connect, right, ourselves to the past through the actions of remembrance, right? So I would stop here. Thank you so much for being here, especially the night.
Any questions? And if you have one, please let me bring the microphone. We're recording here if you'd like to capture your voice. Anyone? Take a deep breath. It's a lot. You know, I would just like to say, as we were sitting here thinking, there is a very interesting concept that has been circulating in the academic world for the last several years. It's called critical fabulation. And I thought about her, Mesa-Bains' work. In many ways, she's creating a completely different way of understanding the world.
Right.
And she's taking bits and pieces from multiple archives and bringing them together.
Absolutely.
It's just astounding,
Yeah.
actually.
No, it's a wonderful point. And part of the idea of critical fabulation, if you're not familiar with it, is that one makes some things up. There's some fabling doing, right?
Yeah.
There's some fiction, but often with historical information, and certainly with a critical stance. And it's not meant to be history in the conventional sense, but really a means of opening up new ways of thinking. What if we imagine the past differently? And that, I think you're absolutely right, Paul, to think about that with this work. That at stake in how we write history is almost everything, right? And it has to do with the stories we tell about who we are, the stories we tell about our families, and very importantly, the stories we tell about our cultures and countries, right? And that perhaps, again, in Mesa-Bains' work, so expressly interested in resisting patriarchy, right? Resisting these structures of oppression, that critical fabulation, and I think domesticana too, right, is a way of activating memory and perhaps using things that are not allowed in kind of high academic art history to make space for new kinds of futures, right, by imagining different kinds of pasts or imagining past in new ways.
Any other thoughts, questions?
Well, I think that part of it is, I notice with a lot of Latin artists that there's always this working out of the two cultural realities that live inside. Like I'm a Chicana, right? I have the conqueror and the conquered blood inside of me. So it's sort of like there's always this, you have all these European ways of creating and thinking, but then you're always returning back to the indigenous part of your culture as well. So I don't know if that has anything to do with, and a lot of people don't understand the history. Even Mexicans don't know their own history a lot of times. So I think that a lot of times you have to discover it on your own. You know, you have to go and do research that because you're not taught.
Yeah.
Really. And so a lot of that does get made up too, or it gets blended, I noticed in her work as well. So I don't know, it's interesting because I always see this return. Frida did it, Diego did it, everybody's done it, going back to the indigenous also for searching for meaning or expression as well. So I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. Sorry.
I wanted to add to that too, because I am Chicana, Mexican American, and I feel like oftentimes we feel like we have to be boxed into being one thing. But when I saw Mesa-Bains' work, how you said she's very layered and she's also multifaceted, multimedia artist, I kind of saw myself in that work, you know, having both the blood of colonizer and colonized. She doesn't box herself in, right? She thinks she can be everything and anything, right? And so when I'm thinking of like my culture, I see a lot of it in it because like my grandma, everything is repurposed, right? So like every little trinket is very important. And it's because we just love like being resourceful and stuff. So I just love like the multifaceted art, the layers, everything, because I think that's just like a representation of like Mexican identity, is that we are not just one thing, we're multiple things. We're indigenous, we're also have some Spaniard and sometimes mixed with other things too. So it's really beautiful to see.
Thank you. Yeah, and she talks about this too, right, of also, and I mentioned briefly, of coming to understand that she had African roots as well, right? And that sometimes in narratives of society, the African presence gets reduced, right, to this kind of binary. But the idea of sedimentation and accretion and absolute layering, right, enables her to bring that sort of history, or that aspect of the history up. And I think too, again, just thinking about domesticana, it has to do with gender, right? How many layers of self there are, perhaps especially for women who have to perform so many roles over the course of a lifetime by tradition, right? And have to pick and choose which aspects of convention they're going to perform to, and obviously men do also, but that's what there are for Mesa-Bains, these two workings out that are going on all the time.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you, Professor O'Rourke, for a great presentation. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.